Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be talking about transplanting, and what I'm referring to with that is the process of taking plants that you've started as seedlings, and some you've potted up already, and we have a video about that. Others are taken directly from the trays that you started the seedlings in and transplanting them into the garden bed where they're going to grow and mature and where you will be harvesting from. And so there's a few key principles that I just want to go over here quickly, and then we're actually going to go out into the field with Emily, and she's going to show us the process of transplanting, working with a few of our eggplants. And so, like I said, a few key principles. One is just taking into account what types of crops you're going to be doing this with. It's similar to when we talked about it in the seedlings video, as well as in the potting up video. These are crops that need a head start before they get into the field. And there may be a few different reasons for that. One is crops that take a long time to reach maturity. And if you're in a short growing season especially, you really need to take advantage of time in the nursery to get those plants started and established. Other times it's crops that are really slow to germinate or face a lot of weed pressure during the germination phase. Sometimes if we just give them the opportunity to get started in a nursery and then transplant them in a clean bed where we've already done some cultivating or some weed management, it sets us up for better success and easier management over the plant's life. And then there's sometimes considerations just around things like your crop schedule and succession planning. To give an example, a crop that we often transplant but can also be direct sown into beds is lettuce. But one of the reasons you might consider transplanting lettuce instead of just growing it directly in your bed is the timing of when lettuce matures. And let's just think, for example, if you're looking for early season lettuce, it's often one of the first crops that you're going to be harvesting, but you rarely just want lettuce by itself. You want to have some other things with it, and maybe some root crops like lettuce. You want to be able to, like radish, you want to be able to have radish with your lettuce if you're going to have like a radish salad or something along those lines. Well, if you plant the two, radish and lettuce, in the bed at the same time in the early season, you'll find that radish will grow faster and be ready for harvest before the lettuce is really at all to a state where you can harvest it even as baby lettuce. And so what you can do is a few weeks earlier than when you're going to be planting out your radishes, you can start the lettuce in your nursery and give it an opportunity to germinate and to get established. And then when you transplant it in, it'll take off and grow a lot more rapidly than if you just seed it directly in your bed. And so if you plan that right, you can end up having some of your first crops of the season getting ready at the same time. And so you have your radishes ripening just as your lettuce is ready to harvest, and it makes for a nice way to be able to combine your crops. Again, just manipulating your schedule and planning that out so that you know what crops you want and how you want to be using them when it comes to actually preparing them in the kitchen. Taking that planning backwards and thinking through, maybe there's an opportunity to transplant some crops in order to have them on timing with crops that you're also direct sowing. So that's one consideration just to keep in mind in terms of why transplanting can be important and why it can be advantageous to you. Now, when it comes to the actual process of transplanting, there are a few key principles to keep in mind. One is always make sure that you have healthy seedlings. If you are trying to transplant seedlings that are withering or diseased or struggling for any reason, they're really going to have a hard time transitioning into your garden bed. And the second point is to make sure that your garden bed is well prepared for the transplants. And so if you're taking even a healthy seedling and you just put it into a garden bed that has not been amended, doesn't have adequate fertility, and you just put that plant in and expect it to go, it's going to struggle. And depending on your soil type, if you put it into really compacted clay, it's going to have a hard time staying moist and getting the moisture and retaining the moisture that it needs in order to continue growing. And you'll experience things like transplant shock until those roots start to get strong enough in the new setting to start reaching out and getting the nutrients and water that they need. And so making sure that your bed is well prepared and then that your seedlings are healthy are really going to set you up for success. What do we mean by preparing your bed? It's going to depend on the crop. Now, a lot of the times when you're transplanting, you're going to be transplanting the nightshade family of crops, or maybe cucumbers and squashes and melons, things that are the long season and are going to be in those garden beds for the whole season or a large portion of it. And so with those crops, you always want to be thinking with your bed prep, how you're going to manage weeds and how you're going to irrigate, and try to have all of that plan lined out before you go out to transplant. And so you'll notice in the video when we go out to the field with Emily, we are transplanting eggplants into a bed where we have used a landscape fabric as a mulch. And then we have our irrigation system already set up underneath that landscape fabric, and the soil has already been prepared and amended so that there's good nutrients available for those transplants to immediately start accessing and start growing. So what types of amendments are good when you're transplanting? You want some amendments that provide fast fertility, and then also fertility that can be sustained and add to the soil health throughout the season. So alfalfa meal is something that we use frequently, feather meal, but one of the very best, which is easily accessible in a lot of nurseries and even just general hardware stores where they sell garden supplies, is worm castings. And worm castings are one of the best available amendments in terms of nutrients and the benefits to the soil that you can get your hands on. It is expensive, so depending on your scale, that's something that you always need to take into consideration, but it's a good nutrient source. It provides immediate effect in terms of nutrient availability, and it also does a lot to benefit the health of your soil and the biodiversity of your soil. So those are a few things to take into consideration. And now we'll head out and join Emily as we're transplanting some eggplants into our spring gardens.
All right, so today we are out here transplanting some of our eggplants that we've started as seedlings and we've potted up. So a few key things to keep in mind as you're transplanting. So first, we got all of the beds prepared. And so that involves kind of raking everything out, getting the beds nice and level and even. We've added all of our amendments. So we've added our inch or two of compost. We've also added some alfalfa meal, which will help feed the life in the soil. We've added our feather meal. If you're going to add worm castings or anything, do all of that first before you actually go to transplant your seedling. So for us, these are really long season crops. So they will be in the garden the vast majority of the season. And so for us to kind of reduce some of our maintenance down the road, we've actually decided to cover these beds with the landscape fabric, which means you need to get your irrigation plan set up in advance. So for us, we're using drip tape. And so we have our 2 lines of drip tape down our bed, and then we're putting the landscape fabric over it. So the landscape fabric will help really reduce our weed pressure, and it will also help retain moisture and kind of a more consistent soil temperature right here for the bed. So the key thing though is to get it really tight, otherwise the weeds will start still kind of pushing up underneath the landscape fabric. You still get a little bit of that anyway, but at least it's much better than if you just had the bed kind of open. So if you want to use other things to cover the soil, you can use mulch, like a straw mulch. There's some people that use a wood chip mulch. There's kind of debate on whether or not that's helpful. So I think a straw mulch is a little bit better. You don't want to use hay because that typically will have weed seeds in it. So you'll want something that's a little more sterilized, that is not introducing new weeds into the bed. So once your bed is prepped, your irrigation is set, then it's important to make sure that you have really moisten the soil as well as moisten the plant. So we always say you kind of want to transplant wet on wet. Will give you the best kind of contact when it's first starting. So you'll go ahead and prepare your hole. So for us, using the landscape fabric, we've just made an X 4 inches or so across that we'll kind of plant into. I'm using a little hori-hori knife just to kind of make a little hole for myself. And then you'll kind of gently just grab your transplant out. Depending on what type of container you have it growing in, sometimes it's easier to get out than other times. And we'll go ahead and just kind of gently put it right in the hole. You want to really minimize disturbing the roots as much as possible. And then you kind of just gently put some of that soil back over the top to kind of close up the hole. Just pat it down gently, and then really that's it in terms of transplanting your seedlings.